Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to welcome our very special guest, Mark Zuckerberg.
Go. Hey. How's it going? Hi. Hi.
Hey, Mark.
Hi.
It's wonderful to see you. Please.
Hey.
We can't believe this.
Good morning, KU. It is an honor to be here with you to conclude this year of travel, and I'm really excited to hear your questions and to talk about everything that I've seen and learned this year.
Wonderful, Mark. I cannot tell you how excited we all are. Thank you for taking the time to do this, and we are so grateful you chose the University of Kansas in beautiful Lawrence, Kansas, as your final stop of this year of travel. And I also want to make sure we welcome everyone who's joining us live from all over the world. So, Mark, I want to tell you a little bit. We're here today with several student leaders across campus. We have students here from our consistently #1 ranked School of Public Administration. We have our students from our top 30 public school, business school. And of course, we are very, very proud that today we have here students from our KU ROTC program. We are, especially in advance of Veterans Day, we're very proud that we have all branches of service with our cadets here today. So just wanted to tell you a little bit. And don't worry if I don't mention everyone, but we have students here from journalism and education to engineering and the whole breadth. And they're all eager to see you. So, welcome to the Jayhawk family, and tell me a little bit. Let's start off. I'm sure people are wondering, how did you end up in Kansas? You've traveled to 30 states this year. Most of us do New Year's resolutions. You do your year of challenge. So, tell me a little bit. What have you done this year?
So every year, I try to take on a personal challenge, right? And the reason is I think it's really important to push yourself to learn and improve, both personally and in work. And I think it would be easy, running Facebook, to spend all my time on Facebook. So I try to carve out especially challenging New Year's challenges. So one year I decided to try to learn Mandarin. That is too hard to do in a year. I stuck with it, but I made only a little progress in a year. Last year I tried to run an average of a mile every year. That's pretty achievable. I tried to read a book every couple of weeks, but this year, what I tried to do was, I just feel like so many of us, the tone of the campaigns leading up to 2016 and the election, I think was just really surprising in terms of how divisive it was, no matter which side you were on, and it just led me to want to get out of my bubble in San Francisco and try to understand more of what was going on around the country. One of the things that struck me was that, running Facebook, which is a global company, I'm more likely to end up traveling to a capital city in another country than I am to a lot of places in our country, right? So that just struck me as something that I wanted to get out and have a chance to learn and hear from folks and just be able to see how people were thinking about their work and their lives and thinking about the future and the opportunities and what they were worried about. Mm-hmm. And this is something that I think is especially important for people in the tech industry to do, right? Because I talked about this up front when I made the post at the very beginning of the year, but globalization and technology have been important trends that have lifted up and made a lot of progress around the world, but I think we're also starting to see that they've also left a lot of people behind. And there's a big gap in the country, and it's getting bigger. And I think that's at the heart of a lot of the most divisive political debates that we have. And just getting a chance to go out and hear people's perspective on what matters to them. My goal was to listen. I feel like I learned a lot this year, and now I hope to take some of those lessons back with me to the work that I do at Facebook and the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative, which is our philanthropy that we do, to see if we can help make some people's lives better. But it's been a very interesting year, and I highly recommend getting a chance to go out of your bubble and hear people's perspectives in other places if you have the opportunity to do so.
I think that's wonderful, and you've raised a number of points that I hope we will explore a little bit more. But I have to start with this. You've been all over the country. You've visited so many places. What's your number one takeaway? If you reflect back on the past year and all the places you've been.
Yeah. The biggest takeaway by far, and big theme everywhere that I go, is that community, and especially local community, I think are much more important to people than we realize, and that we give it airtime for. When you think about it, we all get support from three main areas in our lives, right? You have your friends and family, which is the core of your support. We have our communities, whether they're religious organizations, volunteer organizations, school, organizations that look after us and take care of us. And then we have the government safety net, right? When the first two don't do what they need to. And one of the things that I found really surprising, right, is that if you look at the national debate that we have, the vast majority of it focuses on what the government should do. And to some degree, some of the debate focuses on what families need to do to pick up and do what the government isn't going to do. But not that much of the debate focuses on communities. And the thing that just struck me everywhere that I went, right, and I have stories probably from every state that I visited, were how central communities were to people. So, starting from one of the first visits that I made of the year to Texas, I sat down in Waco with a group of ministers. And one of the things that struck me right off the bat was, they were talking about religion and spirituality and what they did, but almost as important in what and how they thought about their role was building community in Waco, right? So they told me stories about how when a plant shut down nearby, one minister said that he knew that he was going to see couples for couples therapy a few weeks later, right? Because of the strain and the stress that puts on people's lives, right? And that's not something that the government can do, right? I mean, that's not something that that in that particular case that the person's family could have done or the people's family could have done. I mean, that's a real community support function that these ministers were providing. Going to a completely different place, I was on the south side of Chicago in the middle of the year, and I was talking to a handful of students at a school there, and they were telling me that every single one of them knew a friend who was in a gang. And I asked them, well, why are your friends in gangs? What's going on that you're in school and your friends are in gangs? And what they said was, we all need community, and we don't have a YMCA here, right? So we don't have a place to go after school to hang out and get together, and we don't have a lot of positive role models in our community that a lot of us can look up to. We have some teachers, but for a lot of people, they don't have a role model. So the gangs provide that, right? They more than anything economic. What they told me was, the gangs provide this feeling of family, right? I mean, one of the kids said, if you can't find love at home, you can find it on the streets. And I mean, that was really striking, right? And it just goes to show, right? Those two examples. I can give you stories from every state that I've been about this, but that need and hunger for community is so deep, and I think that we don't talk about it enough. So if there's one theme that I feel like I've learned this year, and the common thread through I think all of our lives is, we don't agree on everything, right? I mean, on big policy debates and a lot of the national issues, we may not all agree. But one thing that I've found that a lot of people do agree on is that what matters the most in our lives are, what's happening around us, our friends, our family, our work, our community, and I think I've heard this notion from a lot of people that a lot of folks just wish that if we can turn down the temperature a little bit on some of the divisive debates, then there actually is more common ground than you might hear a lot of the time in the news, just based on what we all care about in our local communities. So, that's one of my big takeaways, is if we can help people focus more of the discussion on building community, on local community, then I actually think it's possible to build more common ground and make more progress together than you might think from some of the national discussions that are going on.
That's a very interesting point. I do agree, humans, we're social animals, we need to belong. But how do we build that community right where we live and try to make a difference? I think that's very well said. I have to ask you though, so what role do you think Facebook plays in building community? I'm asking this quite seriously because I do know that I think of even my own family. For my father, the last year and a half of his life, Facebook was his community. So how could you leverage Facebook for building community for places where these kids in Chicago or other places you've been that say they're looking for community?
Well, we're just one company.
But we are putting you on the spot.
But I do think we can play a role here. And I think that this is so important that earlier this year, I actually changed our company's mission for the first time in our history to now focus on building community. Right? So for the first 10 or 13 years of the company, we were mostly focused on helping people connect with friends and family. And now, we're always going to do that. But now on top of that, we also want to help people build community. And one of the things that I think we first need to internalize is that as a society, we're starting in a little bit of a hole here. Because it's not that community is important and it's in a good place. If you actually start digging into the sociology research, it's actually the case that for the last few decades, membership in all kinds of communities, right, religious, volunteer, all kinds of organizations, has declined as much as 25%. Right, so that is millions and millions of people who need that kind of support from communities who now are not getting it. Right, so that I think means that this is more important than ever, and even more of a reason why we need to shine more of a spotlight on this. So, what we tried to do with Facebook is, we look at how people use our groups and communities products, and it turns out, there are, we realize that there are more than 100 million people who are using groups and define some of the groups that they're in as meaningful communities. So there are a lot more people who are in groups that are just kind of fun, right? I mean, I'm in this group for people who like the same kind of dog that I like, and I get cute photos, but it's not like I'm not like building meaningful community connections through that. Someone is, but that's not for me. But for me, it was when my dad went in for heart surgery and we formed a community around that. That was meaningful, right? So what we define meaningful communities as, upon joining this, it becomes one of the most meaningful parts of your social support network in your life, right? So think about, you get diagnosed with a rare disease. Right now, you have the ability to connect with other people who have that disease around the world to share that experience, right? There might not be anyone in your town, but around the world, someone else is going to have that experience, and you can share that experience and connect over that, and that's a really meaningful community for people. I recently became a parent a couple of years ago. New parenthood. I mean, that is a new experience, right?
That's a big community.
And for a lot of people, that's a big change in your life, and joining a community for new parents where you can share the different things that you're experiencing and get advice. That's meaningful, right? When you're a new parent, joining that kind of a community can become one of the most important things in your life. And in terms of traveling around this year, I've seen a lot of different examples of this. So I went to North Carolina and visited Fort Bragg, which is the biggest military base, I think, in the world.
Correct.
And I had a chance when I was there to sit down with a group of military spouses, right, who told me that when their partners get relocated from one base to another, it uproots their life. Right now they have to find a new school for their kids. They have to find a new home. They have to find a new job. Find new friends in the area. So one of the first things that they do is go look up the Facebook group and community for military spouses near that base. Right now, one of the questions that I started asking myself after that visit was, okay, if we have 2 billion people who use Facebook, then why are only 100 million of them in meaningful groups? Why aren't we doing a better job of connecting more people to meaningful groups? So that now is the whole thrust of what I want our company to focus on. And we have this whole roadmap that we've worked on to help people connect to meaningful groups that are out there, to give people who want to organize these groups the tools that they need to organize them. And I think that if we can do that, then we can start to turn around this trend for the past few decades of people joining fewer groups in society, and can start to strengthen and rebuild the social fabric. But this is a bigger issue, I think, than any one company can fully solve. But I do think it's really important. I think we all need to do our part to work on this.
I think you're absolutely right. I see that too. Like, this is the whole bowling alone phenomenon of how people don't have those groups anymore. But I do like what you're talking about, because I notice on college campuses everywhere all these intersectionalities of identities where people find people that and then use the space to actually physically gather and form community.
Yeah.
I do have to ask you, we talked about communities at core is not just the value you get and the value you give, but also trust and respect and so on. So let's talk about one of the things you've been asked a lot about recently, and that was Facebook and the role in elections. I am really eager to find out, what are you doing to prevent Russian or, frankly, any outside interference in our free democratic process in the United States?
Sure. I mean, this is really important. And this is an area where I think we just have an enormous responsibility. You know, I mean, a lot of people come to Facebook every day to help connect with friends and family. And while they're there, you know, people want to share what's important to them and discuss the most important things that are going on. And it is absolutely our responsibility to protect the security and integrity of that platform so people can have those discussions. So let me, you know, talk for a little bit about this.
Please.
You know, I mean, I think it's very clear at this point that the Russians tried to use these tools to sow distrust, you know, leading up to the 2016 election and afterwards. And, you know, what they did is wrong. And it is our responsibility to do everything that we can to prevent them or anyone else from doing this again in the future. So there are a number of things that we're doing. The first thing that I view as our responsibility is to help our government understand exactly what happened, right? Because, you know, Facebook is one piece of a much broader puzzle on how the Russians tried to attack the democratic process here. So what we tried to do, you know, including in the testimony in Congress a couple of weeks ago, I directed our team, you know, we need to be as transparent as possible to help the government understand from our piece of this, you know, what happened on Facebook, so that way they can put together all the pieces. What happened across other companies, other types of hacking that may have happened, information that the intelligence community has that we wouldn't necessarily have access to. They need to understand that whole picture so they can understand, as a government, what the right way to respond and move forward is. But even, you know, without that, you know, I think we invest a huge amount in security. And we already did, and now we're going to do even more, now that we understand that there are new kinds of threats that we need to face. So already, by the end of this year, we have about 10,000 people at Facebook who work on safety and security. And I talked about this on our earnings call a couple of weeks ago, that we're going to more than double that in the next year to now have more than 20,000 people working on safety and security, doing, you know, both having people review things and building technology and tools so that way we can more automatically find different things that are going on across the network. And you know, the reason why I talked about this on our earnings call a couple of weeks ago is that, you know, we're investing so much in security that it's actually going to significantly impact the profitability of the company. And I just wanted to be really clear about this up front, because I think it's important that anyone who's going to be involved in the company, whether you're an investor or a partner or an employee, you need to know our priorities, right? So I just wanted to be absolutely clear that our priority is protecting our community is more important to us than maximizing our profitability. And that's just a really important part of how we've always tried to run the company. And I think that is our responsibility here. But this is a new kind of threat, right? I mean, nation states trying to attack online communities to try to subvert elections. And but I am confident that with enough work on this and collaboration with other companies and with the government, that we can make progress and make this much, much harder for anyone to do in the future.
I really appreciate your answer. I think that this is on everybody's minds, and I'm glad we were able to talk about it. And what you say also applies to things like globalization and technology. We've talked about the political threat, but earlier you alluded to it. Across the country, a big topic of conversation is what happens, what's the impact of And I'm going to put them both together because they're so intertwined.
They are.
Not just the political, but the globalization and technology, the impact on jobs. What does it do to local economies? What have you found in this 1 year of reflection and travel?
Well, in most places that I've gone, globalization, technology, and trade have been big themes that have come up. And one of the things that really struck me is that when there's a disruption, right? So if you lose a job, that doesn't just impact you and your family in the short term, but it actually it shapes how you think about what you want to do over the long term too, right? So let me give you a couple of examples, right? I was in earlier this year in Millinocket, Maine. It's this town that is just completely. It was built around paper mill. Right, so there was literally no town there before. Then this paper mill company came. It built housing so it could have workers. It built a school there. People in the community and in the neighboring communities knew that if they grew up, they could get a job at the paper mill if they wanted. So it really was very intertwined with the town. And then, for a number of reasons, including globalization and technology, right? Globalization because a lot of the lumber milling work moved a few hundred miles away over to Canada, and technology because now instead of just using wood, more people want to use synthetic wood products that are stronger and cheaper to build homes and other buildings. So for a number of reasons, there's this disruption to the paper mill industry. And so I was talking to a number of the people there, and they're very enterprising and entrepreneurial, and they of course, if you lose a job, you're going to go and work on getting retrained to go do another job. But one of the things that really struck me was, a number of these folks were really afraid that the new job that they were getting trained for was also just going to get replaced by trade or globalization or technology. And I was listening to this, and I was thinking, hey, you just got retrained in something that's a very important modern job. It doesn't seem to me, from what I know at least, like that's really a risk of being replaced over the long term, or for the foreseeable future at least.
Short or medium term.
But it really was shaping how people were thinking about it. And so one guy even said, I wasn't even sure that I wanted to go get another job because I was so worried that that my job might just get replaced. And so that's interesting because we need him to work, right? We need that productivity in our economy. So if that is making it so that people feel lack of confidence and feel like they can't, it's not worth bothering, right? Because of these trends that happened in the past, then that's a really big deal. Now the flip side of this that I also think is really interesting is there was a guy at that round table that I sat down with who had been in trucking for 30 years. And one of the big discussions in Silicon Valley right now is what's going to happen with self-driving cars and self-driving trucks and all this, and how this is going to affect jobs. And at least in Silicon Valley, I find that a lot of the discussion is actually quite pessimistic, right? In terms of people are worried about the future there. But here was this trucker, and he was not at all worried. He was very optimistic about the future. He said, Millinocket doesn't even have good internet. How are we going to have self-driving trucks? I'm fine, right? And across the country, I've talked to a handful of truckers in Iowa. I went to this truck stop, and I sat down and asked a number of the folks there, and I'm like, okay, how do you think about what's going to happen with self-driving cars and trucks? And it was basically the same attitude, ranging from skepticism that the technology would ever really work enough to make a difference, to optimism that if it did, it would actually be helpful to them rather than disruptive. And you have people who are doing long-haul trucking who are like, all right, it would be great if I could take a nap while my truck was driving itself on the freeway, and then I could go do the last mile. That would increase productivity, and I think that there's a really good case for that. But one of the things that I think is really interesting is if you look at globalization and trade and technology backwards, the people who have been affected by it, it really does leave this emotional disruption as well as this economic disruption to what they think their prospects are going forward. Whereas if you think about things in the future, people are much more optimistic, and I think that that's a case that people probably should be more optimistic about the way that the future can go, and not necessarily quite as worried that just because if something happened in the past, it might happen again in the future. The last thing that I'll say on this is that one thing that I think everyone can agree on, regardless of what you think is going to happen with globalization and trade, is that training for modern jobs is really important, right? So that's why, that's one of the big takeaways from a lot of these trips, and that's why yesterday I was in St. Louis, and we announced as part of Facebook this Facebook Community Boost program. Mm-hmm. Because what we found is, you want to build strong communities. Small local businesses are a really important part of communities, right? I mean, I think we can all name, the small business that not only is creating jobs in our community, but is a place that people come together and hang out and, and connect. That's really the center of the community. So the more that we can do to help entrepreneurs use digital tools to build new businesses that can take existing businesses and grow them. Or if you're not trying to create a business, if you're trying to find a job, get the digital skills that you need that those businesses want in employees in order to grow, then I think that would be a really positive step. And I think that's something that we, as a company that understands some of the technology trends, have a responsibility to do. So I'm really happy that we're doing this Community Boost program. We're going to do it in 30 cities across the country. The first version of it already helped train more than 60,000 small businesses, and now we hope to do much more going forward. So that seems to be something that you want to train people for modern jobs that everyone can agree on, and I'm glad that we're going to be doing something there.
You raise some very, very good points, because it's not just an economic decision. It's a way of life. It's threatening. It's to the community. So we need to shore up the individual and the community to be able to prepare for these changes. I do remember you were talking about some people, though, who were able to use this and say, how will we differentiate ourselves, and turn it into a positive and say, maybe I can't play the price game, but I might compete on quality. Do you know any of those?
No, I mean, this is one of the most inspiring things from this year. Is anywhere that you go, there are a lot of challenges, but there are always people making it happen. And I just think that's just a really inspiring thing. So, I mean, one of the stories that really struck me from this year, I was in New Orleans, and I went down to the Ninth Ward, which was the neighborhood that was struck the hardest by Hurricane Katrina. Mm-hmm. And basically, so after the hurricane, a lot of people left the neighborhood, right? Because just completely flooded. A lot of homes were destroyed. And because there weren't a lot of people in the neighborhood, no one would invest to build a grocery store. So the people who were in the neighborhood had nowhere to get fresh food, right? So then there's this guy who I met, Burnell Cotlin, who I think it's worth calling out is a veteran, and it is Veterans Day. So so a thank you to Burnell for his service and to all of you veterans. So Burnell decided that he was gonna take it on himself to build a grocery store, and he the thing is he didn't know anything about building a grocery store. So, but as a veteran, right? He's like, all right, I've done much harder things. I can do this. He went on the internet and started looking at internet videos on how to run electrical wiring and how to install roofing, and he did it, right? He built a grocery store by hand. It took him a little while, so that way people in his community could have a place to get fresh food. And then he was like, all right, I'm not going to stop there. Now I'm going to build a barber shop so people have a place to come together. And then I'm going to build a laundromat because people need that. And then I'm going to build a playground, and I'm going to build an internet cafe. And this guy is like single-handedly not just building what's an important small business in the community, but rebuilding a real cornerstone of the community. I mean, so it's really hard not to go meet someone like Burnell and be really inspired. But the thing that I think is even more inspiring is that there are people like that all over, right? In every place that you go. So I mean, the story that we were talking about around trade was I was talking to a handful of fishermen in the South, and they were talking to me about. There are real challenges around globalization and trade, right? They were talking about how, there are countries like India, and I think they were saying Vietnam, who subsidize exports, right? So the cost of labor in a lot of these places is cheaper, but then on top of that, if you have the Indian government subsidizing the fish exports that you put out, then it's probably pretty hard for Americans to compete on price in some places. So I was going around, and there were a group of 10 folks, and they were talking about how this was a really big challenge in their businesses. And then, of course, there's the one business that kind of figures it out, right? And is like, all right, we're gonna take this this challenge and turn it into a big opportunity. And what they'd figured out was, okay, now that there's more international trade, what they were going to do is not just sell their seafood locally, but sell it internationally too, and sell it as a premium American product, right? So not try to compete on price, but try to kind of flip the whole thing on its head. And so that to me is just, that's like the American spirit, right? That's the entrepreneurial spirit. It's like you go around all these places, and yeah, we have challenges, right? Whether they're things that are due to our policies around globalization or trade, or whether they're natural disasters like Katrina. But there are always people who are trying to work through it and who are coming up with innovative solutions. Just yesterday, I was in Centralia, Missouri, right on my last stop before I came out here. And I was talking to these two brothers. There's young guys. It's 25 and 21 years old. And they run one of the largest free-range egg farms in the country. And you talk to them, and it's like, all right, you guys are the future, right? You're 25 and 21 years old. You've been doing this since middle and high school, right? And yeah, and they have to deal with different regulations that come up. At one point they had to downsize their chicken farm from 25,000 chickens to 7,000 because of some regulations that they needed to manage. But you just get the sense, talking to these folks in their spirit, that they're going to make it happen, right? They're going to figure this out, and it's just inspiring to see.
Well, I love all the examples you're giving, but because I do believe small business, without question, so far outpaces big business in terms of number of jobs created, number of people hired, etc.
Yeah.
But it's also the nobility of business. When they do that, they're building community as well.
Yeah, the stats. 60% of people who work at small businesses, small and medium businesses.
Even though I want all my entrepreneurs listening to go ahead and feel free to build businesses like yours. We're not against big business at all.
We started small too.
I know. Let's talk about, this has been fascinating, and thank you for your answers. I've been curious. 30 stops, and of course, you have to end up in Kansas to cap it off, which we're grateful for. Is there something that has truly surprised you that you didn't expect to see? What would you say? And maybe even something that maybe disappointed you to see?
The biggest surprise by far has been the extent of the opioid issues. And it is really saddening to see. I think people are pretty widely familiar with some of the stats at this point. In 2016, 64,000 people died of drug overdoses. And that's more people than died from AIDS at the peak of the AIDS epidemic. That is more people more Americans than died in the whole Vietnam War. It is more people than die of car accidents and gun violence, I think, combined. And it's growing quickly. So, from 2015 to 2016, I think the number of drug overdose deaths went up by almost 20%. But, you sit down with some of these folks and you just get a sense of how intense both the forces at play are and the impacts on the community. I sat down with a group of recovering heroin addicts in Dayton, Ohio, and I was just asking them to explain it to me. And they're like, well, look, when you're a heroin addict, you're not trying to overdose and die. One woman told me, she said, you're trying to, I at least was trying to shoot up enough to get as close as I could without dying. She's like, oh my God. One man told me, sorry, this stuff is just really upsetting to talk about. One man told me that he was with his friend who was shooting up and started to overdose, and all that he could think about was, I wonder who that guy's dealer is, because that must be really good stuff.
Oh.
And so this is like, so that's just intense, right? This is really. But then you get the sense of how it impacts, not just on a health basis, but everyone around them in the community, right? So I talked to, police officers, right, in Dayton, and they said one day they had 29 overdose calls that they had to go respond to. And one of the thoughts that was going through her mind was, it's important to respond to these. This is critical, but this is also straining our resources, and I wonder what other things that we're not getting to because we have this issue as well to deal with. I think going across the country this year, one of the things that struck me that I don't think we all fully internalize is how this epidemic has affected people's attitudes more broadly on policy issues. Not just, even if it were only a public health crisis, it would be one of the worst public health crises we've ever faced. But there's a lot of data, if you look at political science research, that suggests that one of the biggest correlations with people who voted Democrat and then voted Republican were the counties that had the highest density of opioid-related deaths. One story that just really struck me, that blew me away, I was in Alabama, and I was talking to this guy on his shrimping boat. And I asked him, what issues are you worried about for the country? And he said, terrorism. And it just struck me. I'm like, all right, you're in somewhat rural Alabama. Are you worried for your safety here that someone is going to blow up a bomb? He's like, no, that's not it. He's like, the issue is that there are all these drugs in our community. And I can't hire people because I don't want people on my shrimping boat who are going to be on drugs. I'm fearful for my daughter and her and all the crime that's going on in our city and in our town. And I know that a lot of these drugs are coming in from other places in other countries. And I just think that harm that other places are doing is a big issue for the country. And I mean, so that was like, all right, that's a bunch of issues tied up together, right? That I think people don't think about, right? So, and I think it's easy for a lot of folks who just think about a given policy issue to segment these things, right? And say, okay, here's a public health crisis. Here are a set of immigration issues. Here are a set of public safety issues and jobs, and how do you find people who can do the work? But I think that what you find across the country is that for a lot of people, the attitudes towards a lot of these things are very connected. And I actually think that the opioid issues, I think being so pervasive, have likely had more of an effect on some people's attitudes towards public issues than I think we fully realize. Now, I do think that people, the opioid crisis is starting to get more attention. From my perspective, and what I saw this year, it's still getting nowhere near the attention that it needs. But the good news, if you can call it that, is that you can look at other countries that have had serious heroin and opioid issues, like France, for example, in the early 2000s, and there is a roadmap for how you deal with this. So it's not going to be overnight, right? I think the issue will likely get worse before it gets better. But if we do the right things as a country, and more often than not, this is actually at a state level, there is a roadmap for how you can improve and do better with this and push this stuff forward.
There's no question. I guess as all of you in the tech field say, a friend of mine calls it a wicked problem, but also some of them are solved problems. So we need to figure out, and as you say, it's a multi-pronged issue. It's very, very complex. And so a simple one-size-fits-all won't work. And that's interesting, too. It probably comes back to each community and what you do.
Yeah.
One of the things I was reading about, and I wonder if you have reflections on it, too, where you are, the geography of where you're located, how it might impact you in terms of community. Someone trying to, get over a drug habit.
Yeah.
You were talking, I know that...
No, so opportunity is certainly not equally distributed right now.
I do believe that.
And so one of the big questions is why, right? And one of the things that that I found really striking this year is that it's often the relationships and social capital that you have that make a bigger difference than what you know. And that may seem like a really kind of trite thing to say, but let me give a few examples that I think really drive this home. So we were just talking about opioids a second ago. And, a lot of people who are addicted to opioids, they don't necessarily want to be addicted to opioids. They know that it's bad. They know the things that technically they're supposed to do to get off of it. But if you go to treatment, the first thing you'll do is detox. After that, the next thing that you need to do, that is the next most important step, is to sever all ties with anyone who is still using drugs. Right? So if your best friend is still shooting up, then you have a very high chance of ending up back on drugs and risking your life. Right? Now this gets really tough because what if it's not a friend, but it's your spouse? Right? I mean, it's like that actually is a life or death decision. Right? That you have to, that relationship and that connection ends up being more important than all of the pamphlets or information that you can be told, right? If you can know all that stuff in your mind, but if in your heart and the connections that you have, you're around people who are doing these things, your chance of ending up back using heroin, potentially risking your life, really high. Mm-hmm. Okay. Another example that I just found really heartbreaking. I was in South Bend in Indiana. And I went to a juvenile detention center. And some of the kids who are in juvenile detention center are there for things that would be really serious crimes even if they were adults, right? So they stole something big or they hurt someone. But a lot of the kids who are there because they misbehaved in school. And some of the kids who misbehaved in school get sent to juvenile detention, some don't. And there have been a bunch of studies over time on what the impact is of being there. And what actually is really clear is that if you go to juvenile detention center, you are more likely to end up in prison later in life than if you don't. Right? So I'm not talking about the people who committed things that are pretty clearly crimes. I'm talking about the cases that are more like you misbehaved in school. Right? So you can look at the kids who misbehaved and didn't go to juvenile detention versus the kids who misbehaved and were sent, and the outcomes are much worse. So why is that? I think a pretty good theory is that we're basically building the wrong social network for those kids, right? Where instead of having positive role models around them, we're showing them people who are otherwise doing things that are actually really bad. And that decreases your prospects for having opportunity going forward. Now, some of this stuff is also just about it gets down to the values in communities. And you were asking about different geographies. One of the things that I think is really interesting, I don't know how familiar you are with Raj Chetty's work on opportunity and mobility. And one of the things that he found is that from different counties, people are more likely to go leave and seek opportunity than in other places. And that ends up being a big determinant of if you're born in that county, do you end up having a good chance of having a more economically successful life than your parents. And and you do see these anecdotes. I was in Iowa, and a small town in Wilton, Iowa, and I went to this candy kitchen, it's called, and I got a milkshake, and I was talking to the girl who was making the milkshake, and I was like, all right, what do you want to be when you grow up? And she's like, I want to move to Atlanta and be a dental hygienist. And it's like, all right, good for you, right? And if you look at the data, Iowa actually scores really high, right, in terms of having communities that have the values where people are encouraged to go seek opportunity in different places. And that does end up, I think, being, and part of this is not just values, it's also do you have the economic opportunity to go do it. So that of course is really important. But I think a key thing is that if there aren't as many jobs in rural areas as there used to be, then one of the big questions are, do you have the freedom and desire, if you have the freedom, to be able to go seek opportunity in different places? And that definitely does seem to be different in different places around the country. So there's a lot of stuff that I think we can do on this.
I am so glad that you're paying attention to this, especially as Facebook and in your philanthropic efforts, because the key to what you've said, it comes back to community. Because if there's two kids and they've both done the same thing and one ends up in juvie and one does not, a lot of it does have to do with the social capital that they can mobilize and who can advocate for them and what we can do. So I am absolutely thrilled you are looking into this.
No, there's a lot to do. I mean, on Facebook, I think that there are things that we could do here. And we built a lot of systems over the past 10 years at Facebook to help you connect with people you may know already. I mean, a lot of you are probably familiar with that if you use the product. But one of the questions I asked our team is, can we help people connect with maybe like people you should know, right? A mentor or a teacher. I mean, there's a lot of data that suggests that if you have just one teacher, right, or parent or mentor who can help raise your sights on what you should do, that makes a really big impact. So I think if there's an opportunity to build that, I think that's a big deal. And then of course in our work in the Chan Zuckerberg initiative, and one of the big things that we're working on is criminal justice reform, because to the extent that having kids go to these programs ends up being really negative for their lives, you just want that not to happen when it's not necessary.
I could not agree more. And I'm familiar with the Chan Zuckerberg initiative there. That's why I was talking about that again. I agree. Mm-hmm. And for the students, we always talk about, it's who you know versus what you know, and as though there's a big distinction. And the truth is, who you know determines what you know. So if you don't have certain connections, you never have access to information. Yeah. So I really applaud your efforts on that. All right, we got to get back to you. We've talked about all of your travels all over. Mm-hmm. Have you learned anything about yourself through this process? You know, everyone says you cannot travel without having it impact you in some way, right? You change, not just travel, life, everyday experiences. What have you learned about yourself, Mark Zuckerberg? Inquiring minds want to know.
You know, I think I started this year as an engineer, and now I'm wrapping it up thinking of myself as more of a community builder too. And
I want everybody to be a community builder. Go on, tell me more. What do you mean by that?
You know, the engineering mindset and the values of that are really about problem solving. Mm-hmm. Right, and that's a big deal. I mean, there are a lot of problems, and we need to focus on that. But you know, I think a lot of what community building is, it's about sharing values, right, and being transparent about that, and you know, thinking about supporting people and not just solving problems, and protecting people from external threats.
Interesting.
And I think that from what I've seen, both in the work at Facebook, in a lot of the communities that I visited, and also now as a parent. I think that element is just a lot more important. So, around the country, as we've talked about, I think building community is a really foundational thing that a lot of people need for support, right? It's I think a lot of these things are not necessarily going to come from the government. I think people want them locally, and that's an area that I think we can all help work on. And as a parent, I think you learn that. There aren't that many problems that a 2-year-old has that require an engineering mindset to solve.
Negotiation skills are important at that age.
I don't know that that's an engineering thing, but that's true. But being a parent is very much about imparting values, right? And that I just think is over the past couple of years I've focused on more and more. But also, I mean, you just think about where Facebook is now. In terms of my work there, and yeah, I mean, we have big problems that we need to work through. But I also think that we're at the scale at this point that it's not just about solving the problems. I think that alone isn't enough. I think we also need to be really clear about what our values are that go into the different decisions that we're making, right? And that I think because a lot of these problems are not problems that one company can solve. You need to work together on. So you need alignment on values, and you need to be transparent. And I think we need to recognize that for the scale that we're at, transparency builds trust. And our responsibility is growing, and that also means a responsibility to share more about how we think about solving the problems, and also being more accountable as well. So I think that this is that probably. I'll always be an engineer, but I think this year I really got more of an appreciation for how strongly I care about some of these parts of what I need to do that are around sharing values and building community and supporting folks.
That makes me very, very happy to hear. So now we'll call you Engineer Plus, all right? Because we need those skills, but to be able to bring that compassion and understanding of the complexity of the situation is very important. So last question, and then we'll have a couple more things to cover, I'm sure. Overall, given everything you've seen, the good and the bad, how do you feel about where we are as a country? And would you say overall optimistic? Pessimistic? Where are you? Looking ahead.
Well, if I seem optimistic, it's because I am.
I love it. That's the answer I was hoping for.
I mean, look, one of my favorite sayings is that there are two kinds of people, right? Optimists and pessimists. And the saying goes that optimists tend to be successful and pessimists tend to be right. Okay, and the idea is that if you think that something's going to be terrible, then you're going to go look for data points that prove you right. And you're going to find them. Right? I mean, that's what pessimists do. Right? But if you believe that something can work, and if you think that something can be possible, then you're going to look for a way to make it happen. And even when you make mistakes, even when people doubt you along the way, you're just going to keep pushing forward until you can find a way to make it happen. And the world is full of pessimists right now. And there's no doubt that we face a lot of challenges and that we have a lot of responsibility and a lot of work. But I think we also have a responsibility to remain optimistic that we can solve these problems. Because optimists are the only ones who will. So, Warren Buffett has this saying that I'll adapt slightly for this, but be fearful when others are optimistic, and be optimistic when others are fearful. And I think that we all have a deep responsibility to bring people closer together, and to believe that we can, and to believe that the big questions are not yet answered, but that through our work, we can help people build a better tomorrow. And I believe that we can. And I believe in us, and I believe in you as the next generation of folks, because we're the optimists. And so we have a lot of work to do right now.
I love it. I love it because, as you said, through your experiences, was it Burnells of the world, as well as these young Jayhawks sitting here, as well as young people sitting here listening to you everywhere across the world. It's I have hope that they will be optimistic and they will break through those barriers and build community and find a way to solve these. So I really wish I didn't have to end this conversation because it's so fascinating. Mark, thank you. I know that those of us in the room here, and hopefully the many, many people, I hear you have a few friends around the world that follow you. So the millions of people watching across the world, I know we're all truly grateful because we've learned a lot from you. And I have to say, it's not every day that any community, any group of people would not feel incredibly honored to host someone like you. As a young person, as an entrepreneur, as an optimist, you have changed the world. So I'm very grateful for that. I'm so grateful that you chose to make the University of Kansas your last stop in this tour, in your year of travel. And personally, I have to put in, thank you for making me a cool mom to my daughter, because she's very skeptical. If you meet her, you'll know. I just want you to know that we think you are now part of our family, Jayhawk family, and I want you to come back. We don't care when or how. Do we not want him to come back? Yes? Welcome back anytime. It's just been, wholeheartedly I say, you make me optimistic about the future. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you all for coming out. Thank you, KU. What a great way to end the year of travel. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Rock chalk.